On a Friday evening in November of 1982, Tommy Briggs sat at a corner table at Harlan's Steakhouse in Breathitt County, Kentucky, and said something about Earl Combs that 12 people heard and one person never forgot. That's where this story starts. Not with the blizzard, not with the mountain road at 2 in the morning with ice on every surface and a loaded logging truck on its side blocking both lanes and Tommy Briggs's brand new Peterbilt wrecker sitting dead in the snow with a hydraulic line blown and Tommy himself, standing in the dark realizing he had nobody left to call but the man he had laughed at 3 weeks earlier. With a Friday evening in November, a young man with new equipment and new debt, and the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been wrong about anything that mattered. Tommy Briggs was 34 years old and he had been running Briggs Recovery for 2 years. He had started with one truck and a loan that his wife had co-signed, and he had worked hard enough and smart enough that by the fall of 1982, he had 2 trucks, a yard on Route 15 with a proper sign and proper lighting, and a reputation in Breathitt County as the man to call when you needed something done fast and done right. He drove a new Peterbilt wrecker that he had taken delivery of in April. It was the most expensive piece of equipment in the county that was not owned by a mining company or a government agency. It had a hydraulic boom, factory air conditioning, a sound system, and a cab that Tommy had paid extra to have detailed before the first job. He parked it facing the road so people could see it when they drove past. He was proud of it. There was nothing wrong with being proud of it. He had worked for it. What there was something wrong with was what he said about Earl Combs at Harlan's Steakhouse on a Friday evening in November of 1982, and the way he said it, and the audience he said it in front of. The occasion was a dinner that the Breathitt County Chamber of Commerce held twice a year, the kind of dinner where local business owners ate mediocre steak and talked about economic development and the future of the county. Tommy had been attending for 2 years. He liked attending. He liked being seen at the kind of event where people who mattered showed up. He was at the corner table with the county road supervisor, a man named Garrett, and 2 contractors who did commercial work in the county. The conversation had been about the coming winter, about road conditions, about the logging operation on the north side of the county that had been running heavy trucks on mountain roads that were not built for heavy trucks. Someone had mentioned Earl Combs, had mentioned him the way people mentioned Earl in Breathitt County, as background, as context, as the way things had been before the county had people like Tommy Briggs. Tommy had set down his fork. Earl Combs, Tommy said. You know what Earl Combs is? He's his father's leftover. Luther Combs ran that yard for 40 years, and when Luther died, Earl just sat down in the same chair and never got up. Same truck, same yard, same everything. He shook his head. You want to know what Luther left Earl? A 1946 Mack that burns more oil than diesel and a yard that looks like the war never ended. He picked up his fork. I've got more invested in my hydraulic system alone than Earl Combs has put into that operation in 30 years, Tommy said. That's not a recovery operation. That's a man waiting to retire who hasn't figured out he already has. Garrett, the road supervisor, smiled politely and said nothing. The 2 contractors laughed. Across the room, at a small table near the door where he had eaten alone because the chamber dinner was one of the few times a year Earl Combs came into town for something other than parts, Earl Combs set down his water glass. He was 71 years old. He had been running the yard on Campton Road since his father Luther died in 1967. He had heard everything Tommy said because the room was not large and Tommy had not been quiet. He folded his napkin. He placed it beside his plate. He stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the door. He did not look at Tommy Briggs's table. He did not say anything to anyone. He went out to his truck and drove home on the mountain roads in the November dark, and did not think about Tommy Briggs again that evening, because Tommy Briggs was not worth the thinking. That was November of 1982. In December of 1982, the thinking became unavoidable for both of them. Let me tell you about Earl Combs and the 1946 Mack before I tell you about the blizzard. Because Tommy Briggs had been wrong about what Luther left Earl, and understanding why he was wrong is the only way to understand what happened on that mountain road. Luther Combs had come back from the Pacific in 1945 with a mechanical knowledge that the Army had given him, and a quietness that the war had given him, and no particular interest in discussing either. He had grown up in Breathitt County, had known the mountain roads since he was a boy, and had understood something about those roads that took most people years to learn. Mountain roads in eastern Kentucky in the 1940s were not like other roads. They were narrow and steep, and they switched back on themselves in ways that defeated the logic of anyone who had learned to drive on flat ground. Equipment that worked perfectly in the flatlands failed on those roads because the angles were wrong, and the geometry was wrong, and the ground behaved differently when it was stacked vertically instead of spread horizontally. Luther had bought the 1946 Mack B61 in 1948, 2 years after it came off the line, purchasing it used from a logging company that had run it hard for 2 years, and decided it was no longer new enough for their purposes. Luther had paid $800 for it and had considered it the best money he had ever spent. The Mack B61 was not a wrecker from the factory. Luther had converted it himself. He had fabricated the boom from steel he sourced from a bridge repair project and had welded it himself in the yard over the course of a winter. He had mounted a winch drum behind the cab that carried 400 feet of chain, not cable chain, because Luther had learned on his first mountain job that cable behaved unpredictably on steep grades and chain did not. But the modification that mattered most was not the boom and not the drum. It was the rear axle. Luther had taken the Mack's rear axle apart in 1953 after a job that had nearly defeated him, a logging truck that had gone off a switchback road and come to rest on a ledge at an angle that required pulling from above while managing the truck's tendency to slide laterally down the slope. He had pulled it out, but it had taken him 2 days, and it had taught him that the standard differential was the limiting factor on steep grades. When one rear wheel lost traction, the differential sent power to that wheel, and the other wheel stopped turning and the truck stopped pulling. Luther had installed a locking rear differential, not a factory unit. There were no factory locking differentials available for that application in 1953. Luther had machined the locking mechanism himself, working from an engineering principle he had understood and a set of measurements he had taken from the axle housing, and he had fitted it over a weekend. The locking differential meant that on a steep grade, when one wheel wanted to spin, Luther could lock both wheels to turn together. Both wheels pulled. The truck kept moving. He had used it on mountain grades that no other wrecker in the county would attempt. Earl had grown up watching his father work. He had learned the locking differential before he learned to drive on a public road. He had learned which grades required it and which grades were manageable without it. He had learned to read mountain terrain the way his father read it, not from maps but from the ground itself, from the way the slope felt under the truck and the way the chain moved under load on a steep angle. When Luther died in 1967, Earl had been running jobs alongside his father for 15 years. He took over the yard and the Mack and the locking differential and 37 years of accumulated knowledge about mountain recovery in Breathitt County. He had not changed much about the operation because there was not much that needed changing. The Mack ran, the differential worked, the chain held. The mountain roads were the same mountain roads they had always been. Tommy Briggs had a hydraulic boom and a factory cab, and a payment book that ran to 1989. Earl Combs had a locking differential and 40 years of the same mountain roads. In December of 1982, the mountain roads decided which one mattered. The blizzard came on a Thursday night in the second week of December, not the slow kind that gives you time to prepare. the fast kind that comes out of the northwest and puts 8 inches on the ground in 4 hours and keeps going. By Friday morning, the mountain roads in the north of Breathitt County were closed. Not officially closed, just closed in the way mountain roads close in a serious winter storm, by becoming impassable without equipment that most people did not have. The logging operation on the north side of the county had been running a crew right up until the storm hit. When the storm came in Thursday night, the foreman had made the decision to get the loaded trucks down off the mountain before the roads became impossible. Most of them made it. One of them did not. The truck that did not make it was a loaded Kenworth, 40,000 pounds of hardwood logs, that had been making the descent on the North Switchback Road when the rear wheels lost traction on a patch of black ice at the second-to-last switchback. The truck had gone sideways. The rear end had swung over the road edge, and the truck had rolled onto its side across both lanes, the load partially spilled, the cab resting against the cutbank, the trailer hanging over the road edge at an angle that made the whole rig look like it was deciding whether to go the rest of the way down. The driver walked away. That was the first piece of luck. The second piece of luck was that the trailer's load had partially anchored the rig against the bank, preventing the complete rollover that would have sent 40,000 pounds of logs down the mountain. The road supervisor, Garrett, had called Tommy Briggs at 7 in the morning. Tommy was the county's first call for recovery work. He had the newest equipment and the best response time, and a contract with the county road department that paid him a monthly retainer. Tommy had been on scene by 8:15. He had looked at the truck, he had looked at the road, he had looked at the ice. He had driven his Peterbilt to within 50 feet of the overturned rig, and positioned it for the recovery angle, and engaged the hydraulic boom and begun running his cable to the Kenworth's frame. The hydraulic system had worked perfectly for 22 minutes. Then the temperature dropped 6 degrees in 40 minutes, the way temperatures drop in Breathitt County in December when the wind shifts, and the hydraulic fluid in Tommy's boom system thickened past the operating tolerance of the seals and the primary hydraulic line blew. Not catastrophically, not dangerously. The line blew at a fitting, a clean failure, the kind that could be repaired in an hour in a warm shop. Tommy was not in a warm shop. He was on a mountain road in a blizzard with a blown hydraulic line, and an overturned logging truck blocking both lanes, and the temperature still dropping, and the road behind him icing over worse by the hour. He called his yard. His second truck, his older unit, was not equipped for this kind of mountain-grade work. His employee told him the older truck could get there, but couldn't guarantee it could handle the recovery on that slope in these conditions. Tommy stood on the mountain road in the blowing snow and looked at his Peterbilt, and looked at the overturned Kenworth and thought about who else he could call. There was a recovery company in Hazard. They said the road conditions made it too dangerous to send a truck into the North Switchbacks. There was a company in Jackson. They said the same thing. There was a state highway recovery unit. They said they were committed to 3 other incidents and could not get there until the following morning at the earliest. Tommy stood on the road in the blowing snow, and the temperature kept dropping, and the ice kept building, and the logging truck kept sitting there deciding whether to finish its rollover and take the road edge with it. He looked at his phone. He thought about the steakhouse in November. He thought about what he had said and who had been in the room. He dialed Earl Combs' number. Earl answered on the second ring. He was in his garage when the phone rang, which was where he usually was in the early morning, doing the maintenance work that kept the Mack running through conditions that maintenance was the only answer to. He had heard about the accident on the scanner. He had known, in the way that men who understand terrain know things, that the North Switchback Road in these conditions was going to be a problem for equipment that had not been built for it. He had not offered to go. He was not a man who inserted himself into situations he had not been invited into. Tommy's voice on the phone was not the voice of the man at the steakhouse. It was a different voice, smaller, more careful with its words. "Earl," Tommy said, "I've got a situation on the north switchback. My hydraulic line is down and I can't get anyone else up here. I know what I said at the chamber dinner. I know you heard it. I'm asking anyway because I don't have another option, and there's a truck up here that's going to go the rest of the way off this road if someone doesn't get to it before the ice gets worse." Earl was quiet for a moment. He looked at the Mack. He looked at the chain on the drum. He looked at the temperature gauge on the garage wall. "We're exactly on the north switchback," he said. Tommy told him. Earl thought about that section of road. He had been on it 30 times over 40 years. He knew where the solid ground was at the cut bank. He knew where the road edge was soft under the gravel shoulder. He knew the grade at that switchback was 11%, and he knew what 11% meant for a 40,000-pound load on ice. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Earl said. He hung up. He did not say anything about the steakhouse. He did not say anything about the chamber dinner. He did not say anything about what Tommy had said in front of 12 people. He put on his coat and started the Mack. Tommy heard the Mack before he saw it. He was standing at the road edge above the overturned Kenworth, watching the trailer's angle in the wind, when the sound came up from below. Not the clean hydraulic hum of modern equipment. Something older and more deliberate. A diesel note with age in it, cylinders firing with the authority of an engine that had been kept running long past the point where most machines were replaced. The Mack came around the lower switchback in the blowing snow, moving at the speed mountain roads required, which was slow, which was the speed Earl always moved on mountain roads, because the mountain roads had taught him that speed was not what they rewarded. Tommy watched it come up the grade toward him. The Mack did not slip on the ice, not because the road was better where Earl was driving. The road was the same ice it had been for Tommy. The Mack did not slip because Earl engaged the locking differential at the bottom of the switchback approach, the way his father had taught him, and the way 40 years on these roads had confirmed. And with both rear wheels locked and turning together, the truck climbed the grade the way it had always climbed grades in these conditions, slowly and without drama and without stopping. Tommy watched it climb. He had driven these roads for 2 years. He had never seen a wrecker climb that section of the switchback in these conditions without at least one moment of wheel spin. The Mack parked behind Tommy's dead Peterbilt. Earl got out. He was 71 years old in his work coat, the one he wore every day. He walked to the road edge and looked at the overturned Kenworth below. He looked at the angle. He looked at the cut bank. He looked at the trailer's position relative to the road edge. He did not look at Tommy. He walked back to the Mack and began uncoiling chain. Tommy watched him work and did not speak because there was nothing useful he could say. Earl spent 20 minutes reading the situation before he ran a foot of chain. He walked the road above the Kenworth twice, testing the shoulder with his boot at the cut bank side, finding where the solid material was beneath the gravel. He looked at the load distribution, at the way the logs had shifted when the truck rolled, at which side of the rig was bearing the most weight against the bank. Then he positioned the Mack at the cut bank edge of the road above the Kenworth, with the driver's side rear wheel against the rock face of the cut, and he engaged the locking differential and set the parking brake, and let the cut bank itself serve as the anchor that kept the truck from sliding on the grade. He ran chain down from the drum to the Kenworth's frame, not to the most obvious attachment point, not to the point Tommy would have chosen, but to a point on the rear frame rail that Earl had selected after feeling the load distribution through the chain as he walked it down to the truck. He wrapped the chain around the frame rail twice and hooked it back on itself. He walked back up to the Mack. He engaged the first drum's PTO. The chain came up off the road surface one link at a time, loading from the drum outward, the weight of each link transferring to the next as the tension built. Not a snap, not a sudden load, a patient, building tension that told Earl everything he needed to know about what was below him and what it was going to take. The Mack's engine dropped to its working note. On the ice in the blowing snow, with 11% of grade under the rear wheels, the locking differential held both wheels to the road, and the truck did not move and did not slip, and the chain kept loading. Tommy stood at the road edge watching. The Kenworth moved. 1 foot, upward and toward the cut bank, rotating around the axis Earl had calculated, the trailer swinging back from the road edge as the rear frame pulled toward the bank. The logs shifted in the load and settled. The trailer came back from the edge. 3 feet, 5 feet. The Kenworth's cab rotating off the cut bank, the windshield coming up, the truck finding a new resting position that was stable, both axles on the road surface, the trailer clear of the edge. Earl disengaged the PTO. The drum stopped. He sat in the cab for a moment. Then he got out and walked to the road edge and looked at the Kenworth. He looked at the trailer. He looked at the road edge. The rig was stable. It would need a proper recovery to get it upright and moving, but it was no longer in danger of going the rest of the way off the mountain. Earl walked back to the Mack and began coiling chain. Tommy was standing 10 feet away. He did not say anything for a long time. "Earl," Tommy said finally. Earl kept coiling. "At the steakhouse," Tommy said, "in November, what I said about your father, what I said about you." Earl looked up from the chain. Tommy looked at him. He was 34 years old, and he was standing on a mountain road in a blizzard next to a man he had publicly dismissed 3 weeks earlier, and he did not have any of the words that the situation required. "I was wrong," Tommy said. "Everything I said was wrong." Earl looked at him for a moment, the same level look, the same stillness. Then he went back to coiling chain. "Yes," he said, "you were." He said it without heat, without satisfaction, the way a man states a fact that has been demonstrated and does not require further discussion. He finished coiling the chain and closed the Mack's equipment box and climbed into the cab. Tommy stood in the snow. "Earl," he said, "I need to ask you something." Earl looked at him through the window. "That differential," Tommy said, "the way you came up the switchback, the way the truck held on the grade, what is that?" Earl looked at him for a moment. "Come by the yard sometime," Earl said. "I'll show you." He put the Mack in gear and began the descent. Tommy Briggs paid Earl's invoice the following week. He paid it without negotiating the rate, which was lower than it should have been, and he added to it without telling Earl he was doing so. He drove out to the yard on Campton Road on a Tuesday morning in January. Earl showed him the locking differential, showed him how it worked, showed him what it did on a grade that a standard differential could not manage, explained what Luther had built and why, and what it had taken to machine the locking mechanism from scratch in 1953. Tommy sat on a stool in Earl's garage and listened for 2 hours. He asked questions. Earl answered them, not with any performance of generosity, just with the directness of a man who had been asked something he knew the answer to. At the end of the morning, Tommy stood up and looked at the Mack. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone about the differential?" Tommy asked. "You could have marketed it. You could have built a reputation on it." Earl wiped his hands on a shop rag. "The people who needed to know about it found out when they needed to," Earl said. "That's always been enough." Tommy drove back to Route 15 thinking about that answer for the entire drive. He thought about it for longer than that. In the spring of 1983, Tommy modified his own truck. He did not install a locking differential. That was not an option on his Peterbilt platform without fabrication work he was not yet capable of, but he changed the way he worked mountain jobs. He started doing what Earl did, walking the terrain before he ran cable, reading the load distribution before he chose an attachment point, taking 20 minutes to understand a job before he started on it instead of pulling up and hooking on, and finding out what the job required the hard way. He started calling Earl when he had a mountain job he was unsure about, not to hand the job off, to ask what Earl would look for, to describe the terrain and the conditions and hear Earl's questions in return. Earl always answered, not at length, not with lectures, with the specific, practical answers of a man who had been on those roads for 40 years and had already worked through every version of the problem Tommy was describing. The two men were not friends in the way that people who share backgrounds and temperaments become friends. They were something more specific than that. They were two men who understood the same roads and had learned to respect that understanding in each other. Tommy never again said anything dismissive about Earl Combs or Earl's operation, not at the chamber dinner, not at the parts store, not anywhere. Not because he was afraid of how it would look, because he knew better now. Earl Combs ran the yard on Campton Road until 1997. He was 86 years old that year, and his eyes had gotten bad enough that he did not trust himself on mountain roads at night, which was the only condition under which he had never felt entirely confident anyway. He told his nephew, a 40-year-old man named Curtis who had been helping in the yard for 8 years, that the yard was his. Curtis had not grown up in the yard the way Earl had grown up in his father's yard. He had come to it as an adult, drawn by the work and by Earl's example, and he had learned everything he knew about mountain recovery from watching Earl and from Earl's deliberate, patient teaching. He kept the yard. He kept the Mack. He maintained the locking differential the way Earl had maintained it, which was to say carefully and consistently, and before it needed attention rather than after. Tommy Briggs still operated in Breathitt County. He had expanded his operation twice since 1982. He had better equipment, more trucks, a larger yard. He had developed a genuine reputation for mountain recovery work that was built on the things Earl had taught him, directly and indirectly over 15 years. When people in the county asked Tommy who had taught him to work mountain roads, he told them. Earl Combs, he would say, Luther Combs' son, the yard on Campton Road. And if they looked at him with any surprise, if they showed any sign of knowing what Tommy had said at Harlan's Steakhouse in November of 1982, Tommy did not explain or qualify or seek absolution. He just said it again. Earl Combs, the best mountain recovery operator this county has ever had. I was the last person in Breathitt County to understand that, and I found out on a switchback road in a blizzard, which is probably exactly where I deserve to find out. Earl Combs died in 2004 at the age of 93. His funeral was held at the Baptist Church in Campton and the building was full. Mountain people, farmers, loggers, county road workers, men from the mining operations, men who had called Earl from situations that nobody else could address. Tommy Briggs came. He was 56 years old and he sat in the third row, and he did not speak during the service, but afterward he found Curtis at the reception and stood with him for a while. Your uncle, Tommy said, November of '82, at the chamber dinner. I said something about him and about your grandfather that I had no right to say. Earl heard it. I know he heard it. And 6 weeks later he came up that switchback in a blizzard and pulled me out of a situation I had no way out of. Curtis looked at him. He never told me that story, Curtis said, not the part about the dinner. Tommy nodded. I know, that was like him. Curtis was quiet for a moment. He told me about the switchback job, Curtis said. He said you were a young man who knew how to work hard and hadn't yet learned the difference between hard work and knowledge. He said the mountain would teach you eventually, and it did. Tommy looked at his hands. It did, he said. The yard on Campton Road is still there. Curtis Combs runs it. He has a newer truck for the daily work, a modern hydraulic unit for the standard calls, the things a yard needs to stay current. But the 1946 Mack is in the back of the garage. Curtis starts it once a month. The locking differential still works. The chain on the drum has been replaced twice since 1982. The drum has not. The mountain roads are the same mountain roads they have always been. Narrow and steep and unforgiving of anyone who approaches them without understanding what they require. Curtis gets called for mountain jobs that other operators decline. Not often, but when the conditions are right, when the grade is steep and the ice is bad and the modern equipment has reached its limits and backed off, the phone rings and Curtis drives the Mack out of the garage and up into the switchbacks. He moves at the speed the mountain requires. He reads the terrain before he runs a foot of chain. He locks the differential when the grade demands it, and he lets the drum do what it was built to do, and the thing that would not move, moves. Earl Combs never put a sign on the yard large enough to read from the road. Curtis has not changed that. The people who need to know where the yard is find out when they need to. That has always been enough. Tommy Briggs retired in 2015. He sold the business to a younger operator who had worked for him for 12 years. On the last day, he cleared out his desk in the yard office on Route 15. In the bottom drawer, he found something he had put there in January of 1983 and had not moved since. A shop rag, folded, with grease on it from the morning he had sat in Earl's garage, and Earl had wiped his hands and set it on the workbench, and Tommy had, without quite knowing why, put it in his coat pocket when he left. He held it for a moment. Then he drove out to road and found in the garage, and handed it to him. Looked at it. It's from that January, Tommy said. The morning your uncle showed me the differential. I don't know why I kept it, I just did. Looked at the shop rag, he looked at Tommy. He folded it and put it on the workbench in the same spot it had come from 32 years earlier. That's where it belongs, said. Tommy drove home on the mountain roads for the last time as a working operator, the same roads he had driven for 33 years, the roads that Earl Combs had known since before Tommy was born. He drove them at the speed they required. He had finally learned that.